This is a continuation of a pasta I narrated back on July 2nd of this year, called I Thought I Was Working for Amazon, but I Was Delivering Packages for the Dark Web. That creepypasta provides a little backstory to this story. However, the first few minutes of this story will briefly cover what you need to know. Ever since I ran away from home and took different kinds of jobs in an attempt to have a better life, I was faced with different challenges and a few embarrassingly pathetic situations. I always managed to pull myself back up and move on, but the difficult situation I've gotten myself into when I moved to the city was far different from the ones I managed to get out of. The problem was not like a bad, underpaid job or a horrible boss, but the existence of the situation itself. Myself and my friend Gary were thirsty for a better job when we both received a shady email from an unknown delivery service center. Due to our desperation, we took the invitation and surprisingly got hired right away. It was the easiest job I had ever had, and the pay was pretty decent. The company posed as a third-party delivery center providing their service exclusively for Amazon. The warehouse was unnamed, including the delivery vans. The supervisor himself was a questionable character. I wanted to ask questions, but I also wanted to keep the job, so I just kept my mouth shut for a long time. Everything was great until me and Gary accidentally rip opened one of the packages we needed to deliver, and we discovered that it contained a human arm. The very small and hardly noticeable logo of a black cobweb stamped in every single package apparently meant something. The truth was right under our noses the entire time. The courier company we were working for had no affiliation with Amazon at all. We were delivering packages that were coming in and out of companies from the dark web. Needless to say, we were both terrified and couldn't fathom the messed up situation that we put ourselves into. We wanted to quit right away, but after being forced to continue our delivery of the arm, I received a call. We assumed it was the owner of the company himself, and he indirectly said that he could see everything we do, and it would be in our best interest to continue the task without question. The vans were bugged with a number of surveillance devices, but we figured out a way to work around them after our discovery. Apparently, those weren't the only ones. We had no idea how this man was able to observe everything that was happening. I threatened him by saying that I would tell everything I know to the authorities, but even the head of the city police was their regular customer. We couldn't run away from it. We couldn't run away from them. We were left with no other option at the moment. We were forced to continue the delivery, as the man said, without question. Unlike me, Gary already had a hunch that we were delivering packages for the customers on the web. He chose not to tell me about it because, well, he knew that I would not be okay with it. He was even convincing me that it wasn't all that bad, although he also didn't expect that we would be handling body parts. He assumed that most of the packages we were delivering were nothing more but illegal goods. One of the packages he was supposed to deliver contained a rare and chronic kind of weed, and he smoked it. He was very apologetic when we arrived at the house of the package owner, and was drooling himself as he discussed how much of a big fan he was of the man's items. Gary was very lucky to get off the hook pretty easily. The owner was a mellow old man and just asked Gary to pay for the stuff he took. He was supposed to sell it on the dark web anyway, so Gary just practically became a customer before the item even arrived. Ironically, the old man even invited us in for coffee. I wanted to refuse for obvious reasons, but the glow in Gary's eyes said otherwise. We just delivered a human arm and a bunch of packages containing God knows what. I wasn't exactly in the mood for a cup of coffee, and I don't smoke weed, but I figured that he might know something about this company we were working for. So, we went in. It was our last drop anyway, and it was pretty obvious that there was no way Gary would turn down the offer. He preferred to be called by his username, Greenie420. No wonder Gary immediately recognized him when he saw the name on the package. Greenie showed us his shop, which was more like a shack filled with jars of different strains of marijuana and a bunch of hippie posters. As I sipped my coffee while the two potheads were smoking and laughing their asses off for no reason, I started to ask Greenie some questions. The man that called me said that the customers were aware that it would be us who would deliver the packages, and it was confirmed when he showed me his phone. They would get notifications whenever a package would arrive, and the person who would deliver it was always indicated. I clicked on the name, and a full profile of Gary popped up, including a photo. I went ahead and bluntly asked Greenie what he knew about this courier service we were working for. And hearing what he said just made me realize further how big of a scheme we unknowingly got ourselves into. The delivery service was nothing more but an insignificant fraction to the immensity of this underground syndicate, and it was merely implemented in order to get their small transactions done swiftly and openly. They opened a number of big sites, shops, and shows that were exclusive for their members. There were rumors most of the members were people with remarkably high influence that could easily toy with political powers and benefit from severe international conflicts. They were mostly spoiled brats of the elite families and the insanely rich bored people who were into extremes. I asked him how he knew these things and what exactly was the company known for, and he said that their presence on the dark web was well enough known, but most would choose not to mingle with their business. He never got to see nor access anything that involved this syndicate, aside from their delivery service, since all the other things could only be accessed by paying insane amounts of Bitcoin. I could sense in his voice that he was dead serious about the matter, as he told me and Gary that it would be best for us to not even think of messing with him. All he knew about it was their highly intimidating grandness, but he didn't really know what they were. And the reason why we never got to know what the company's name was, because it didn't exist. The secrecy about whatever this syndicate could be was just insane. I was completely dumbfounded by all of this information. My thoughts were all over the place, that I openly shared to Greenie that we delivered a human arm. I was thinking that it might have something to do with the syndicate's main affairs, but he just laughed at me. He told me that it was probably just some necrophiliac kink someone has, and was totally irrelevant to everything. After an hour of contemplating and stringing a train of thoughts about the matter, Gary and I had to head back to the warehouse to return the delivery van. Nobody was around at the time, but there were numerous CCTVs surrounding the property. I didn't think that it would be possible to be intimidated by an old and badly patched up building, but I was. Who was watching these cameras? Who was the man on the phone? What should we do next? These questions kept resounding inside my head again and again, even after we arrived at our apartment. Unlike Gary, who immediately shut down with a smile on his face due to being totally wasted, I couldn't even close my eyes and try to sleep. They hired individuals like us who had no significant role in society, so we were practically ghosts and easy to dispose of. If what Greenie said was true, having access to the city's CCTVs would be done by them effortlessly. That was probably how the man was able to observe us, aside from the surveillance bugs in the van. I could see the addresses on the packages. They came from faraway places. What was the extent of their reach? How could I get away from this? I couldn't think of any plausible solution at all. I kept on trying to think my way out until my mind gave up and I finally passed out. The next day came and I was awakened by Gary's loud music. Unlike me, he obviously had a good rest, just as carefree as he always was. There was no sign of any worry in him at all. He was chatting with his new buddy, Greeny 420, while smoking a joint early in the morning. He even asked me if I would like to hang out with them later on. With all the pressure and tension built up inside of me, I carelessly lashed out at him. I asked him how he could be so chill despite our situation. We got involved in a syndicate that could easily erase us like flies. Gary just told me that it ain't all that bad. Well, he could be right. All I could feel was the fear at the time. Perhaps his carefree attitude was a better approach. We showed up to work since there was no other option. Our address, our faces, pretty much all the information they needed to track us down if we would escape were recorded. They got their eyes in every corner of almost everywhere. All we could really do was to continue the service. Gary crashed his delivery van last time. That was how we discovered the surveillance devices. Surprisingly, the supervisor just gave him another one without saying a word. It was a struggle to just go on the same routine without thinking of what I already knew. Perhaps it was an easy thing for someone like Gary, but it wasn't for me. I had to force a particular mindset in order to get by and not think of what the packages might contain. Dropping each of them off within seconds and running back to the van like a frantic lunatic. Days passed with the same struggle. The tension has finally gotten the best of me, and I tried to drive away at one point. I went out of the route and just drove off. But my path was blocked by 2 plateless vehicles, and I was too frightened to go further, and so I just drove back and continued on with the deliveries. Gary was handling the situation pretty well and still managed to fool around. He even got a new tattoo of a marijuana leaf with the dark web symbol at the center of his back. I envied his optimism and his idiocy. I just couldn't brush off my concerns that way. He noticed that I was under pressure for days and decided to do something with it. Gary thought that knowing more about this secret syndicate would prove that I was overthinking it, so we met up with one of his friends one night. We went to a shoddy internet cafe. He introduced me to the owner, Evan. He was another questionable individual like his other peeps. He told me that Evan was a hacker who once broke into the police records to delete Gary's offense record, and he would try to break into the system of the syndicate. He went into the dark web to search for leads. It was a harder task since the company didn't even have a name. After several hours of searching, he finally showed us what he found. He couldn't break into the main sites, so he just went into the files of some users who were said to be members. What he uncovered were just pictures and video screens recorded from private rooms of BDSM groups and a bunch of cybersex shows. Gary started laughing and told me that this is what I was worried about, that, I was worried for nothing. What Evan was able to reveal lifted some of the tension off my chest, though. The pictures and videos were still a disturbing sight to see, but at least it was not as worse as I thought it would be. If all I had to deal with were a bunch of freaks with weird fetishes, then I could handle it. I thanked Gary for what he did. He might be a reckless pothead, but you know what? He was a genuine idiot friend of mine. We went to work as always and delivered the packages. I didn't even think of getting away this time since there was no immediate need to do so. Even though the packages could be containing something really messed up, it was no longer my concern. Things were fairly tolerable after all. Or so we thought. After we delivered all the packages for the day with ease, we went back to the warehouse as usual. Unexpectedly, we saw the supervisor standing in front, as if he were waiting for our arrival. Now, he wasn't usually there whenever we parked the delivery vans. With his long sleeves rolled up to his elbows, showing his sleeve tattoos matched with his ridiculously large gold rings, he smiled at us with his golden teeth and asked us to go inside. It felt like our first day all over again. He told us that we needed to deliver 2 more packages. They said that these packages were of great importance and they needed to be delivered right away. He even paid us in advance for the overtime. He gave us a form and said that it had to be signed. I couldn't help but notice the suspicious grin on this overdressed man's face. But I had a fairly good day so far, so I didn't ask any questions. The boxes were big and really heavy. Both me and Gary struggled to lift each one. Our navigator automatically updated and showed us the route we had to take. The exact address of the drop was not indicated, so only the GPS would lead us there. Gary was still high as hell since his last individual delivery for the day was at Greenie's. He was laughing as he was just trying to tell me a story, but all I heard were pointless mumblings, and I didn't really pay any attention to what he was trying to say. When we finally arrived at the location, Gary said that the place seemed oddly familiar. He kept on looking around as we carried the boxes out of the van. He kept on saying that he's been here before, but he couldn't remember why and when. I was about to knock on the door when I noticed that it was open. I tried to call out to the receiver, and it was then that I noticed the name of the recipient wasn't printed on the form. Our supervisor said that the form needed to be signed, so I kept on calling and knocking, but nobody came out. The neighborhood didn't look too friendly, so we decided to go in and place the heavy boxes inside. We were both already inside the house, and we kept on calling whoever was in there, but nobody was answering. After a few minutes, Gary said that the house looked familiar. He stared at the walls, the floor tiles, and the displays. He casually walked around the living room and stood right in front of the family picture hanging on the wall. I told him not to be too comfortable since we were technically trespassing. Going inside the receiver's house wasn't a part of the protocol. Gary was just ignoring me, and his eyes was stuck on the family's picture, and he suddenly shouted in excitement when he finally remembered. He identified the kid in the photo. It was Evan's house. He said he was only here once and it was a long time ago. He walked further inside and started calling out Evan's name loudly. I had no choice but to shut the door and follow him. But then, suddenly, Gary stopped calling. Gary's feet were locked on the floor when he went into the dining area. His eyes were opened wide as tears fell across his face. His jaw just dropped. I could hear the uncomfortable breaks in his breathing as he whimpered, as if his throat suddenly locked and he was choking. He was profoundly terrified that he couldn't breathe. I turned my head to see what he was looking at, and right on the table was a severely violated corpse lying on his chest. The table was soaked and dripping with blood. The skin on the back was stretched open by metal rods to form wings, and the ribs were snapped back and protruded outwards like rows of spines. His head was turned to an extreme degree in order to face the front. It was Evan, turned into a Viking's iconic ceremonial torture method of the Blood Eagle. Amidst the horror right in front of us and the silence surrounding the house, I suddenly heard a tearing sound. It came from the living room where we left the boxes, and I tried to drag Gary with me to check what it was, but he was overwhelmingly shaken that he just fell on the floor when I pulled him. I went back to the living room myself, and there I saw the 2 large boxes we brought in with us were opened. It was ripped from the inside. There were people inside the boxes, and we brought them in ourselves. There was no recipient. This wasn't a delivery. It was a setup. Someone suddenly snuck behind me and started to choke me with a plastic bag on my head. I strangled as much as I could to fight back. I spun left to right to shake this person off. I blindly threw punches and elbows until I got a hold of something from the shelves, and I swung whatever it was I was holding wildly until I hit someone, and then I suddenly felt a heavy blow of what sounded like a bolo blade that swiftly swished in front of me. My left hand was cut, and I screamed in fear and in pain, and despite all my efforts, I was totally helpless. My hand was hanging by a thread. The last things I remember were losing breath, the plastic against my face, and the foul stench of chloroform before I passed out. The next thing I knew, I was awakened by the noises of groans and screams of different individuals suffering. I felt the cold railings on the side of the bed and the texture of rough leather belts. I found myself strapped on a bed with a number of IVs attached to me. Even my neck was tightly restrained. I didn't know where I was. I didn't even know what was happening. Chains of questions flooded my mind with fear. Why was I restrained? Why did they take me? Where the fuck is Gary? And what are they doing to me? A person in a lab coat suddenly walked in, and he was speaking with a foreign language, and I didn't understand a thing. But I was sure that it wasn't good, as I saw the sickening grin on his face. I screamed. I called for help. There was nothing else I could possibly do at that point but to beg and cry for help. But I was nothing more than one of those voices of suffering men that woke me up to this nightmare. The stranger pulled at a syringe and injected me. And then I dozed off until I drifted away and lost consciousness completely. As I woke up again to this nightmare, I found myself chained inside a red room. My arms and legs were tied to poles. My left arm was mounted with some kind of metal brace. And it was just then that I remembered that my left hand was cut almost completely clean off. Next to me was a metal table filled with different blades and saws, and there was someone standing right next to it. He grabbed one of those sharp blades off the table and walked towards me. He was trying to fit it in the brace of my left arm. He walked back and forth as he grabbed different things from the table and tried to fit them in my arm. He kept on going at it for a long time until he saw a large one on the lower level of the steel table. It was an arced, toothed blade without a handle. It was wearing a lab mask, but I could hear his chuckle behind it. He grabbed this particular blade and measured it to the brace. I could see in his eyes that he was very pleased. Then he grabbed a drill on the table and a couple of long screws, and he casually started drilling from the plate of the brace and through my flesh. I began to scream as I just couldn't handle the pain. I could feel my skin and muscle being grinded by the drill until it was suddenly hit a vein. I bawled and growled and moaned. I could feel my heartbeat rapidly increasing in a very unnatural speed, and I felt some kind of heat crawling through my veins. Through the pain of the drill, I grew extraordinarily enraged. As this guy moved closer to me, I tried to bite him. Unfortunately, I was only able to tear off a piece of his coat. He got mad and swung the grill, which scraped across my face. And again, as I felt the pain, my rage was heightened even further. It was as if my veins were boiling and my body was on fire. This unusual sensation of creeping heat and heightened adrenaline crawled up to my head, and I passed out. I was rudely awakened by a strong pressure of a water hose. My head felt heavy. Because of what I did, they decided to put a metal mask on me. My left arm was heavy as well. The guy managed to mount this peculiar blade on me, and it was unnecessarily dense. I was locked in a cage like an animal, which they pulled across the corridor. As we went, I saw a number of individuals in cages. The place was barely lit by yellow lights, but I could see that they were all in terribly inhumane conditions. Some of them were severely modified. There was a man with amputated legs mounted on metal wheels, holding a spiky shield and a lance. The other had his limbs extended by thick iron rods coiled in barbed wires and spikes that he could barely fit in his cage. There was a tank mounted on his back and a tube extending at the front of his mask, which looked like a flamethrower. But what caught my attention the most was a large muscular man sitting quietly with a large axe. He was probably at least 7 feet tall, if he would stand. His mouth was shut, yet I could hear a small, high-toned voice coming from his cage. So, this was the secret of the Syndicate. They take people and bastardize their bodies like toys. This cruel and inhumane thing was done for heartless people willing to pay for a merciless freak show. This was indeed far beyond what I could have imagined back then. With these weapons put on us, I could already tell what was to come. We arrived in a large room and they left me there. They securely locked the thick metal door behind them. A number of lights turned on that blinded me for a moment, and I could smell the stench of blood inside this place. It was surrounded by a number of cameras and microphones. A man that was also wearing a mask was at the opposite side of the room. He was also locked in a cage, carrying a short axe and a sword. And then I suddenly heard a beep. The locks on the cage were unlocked, and as I stepped out, so did the other man on the other side. The room was spacious. It had a rough ground, cement walls without windows, and a domed ceiling. It looked like we were underground. There was a large message on the wall, written in bold red. Kill, or be killed. The guy on the other side immediately charged at me, screaming. He relentlessly showered me with multiple slashes of his axe and sword from left to right. I shouldn't be thankful for it at all, but I was glad that the arced blade was mounted firmly to my arm. He was incredibly fast and agile. I was totally frightened for my life. All I could do was block his attacks by raising my arm. I didn't want to hurt this man. He was just like a victim of this cruel freak show like me. But by the screeches and guttural screams he was making, it was clear that this person had totally lost his sanity. If it wasn't for the concave sides of my blade, his attacks would have easily slipped and hit me. As I backed off little by little, I was driven against the wall. I crouched as I tried to endure this madman's mindless slashes that didn't seem to get any lighter since his first strike. And one finally slid through my defense. His sword reached my leg, and it left a deep cut. Like how I felt before, my blood started to boil as I felt the pain from the cut of his sword. I started to gain some ground, and his attack suddenly felt lighter. I still refused to attack, but I started to feel like I wanted to. What was this feeling? Something was overcoming my senses. As I tried to assess my mental state amidst the fight, another attack slid through my defense, and he managed to cut my chest. My fear was totally overwhelmed by rage just then, and I started to push him back. I felt the heat running through my veins once more, but by this time, I was free to let it all go. This man right before me was trying to kill me since the beginning. I should do the same. I wanted to. I started to swing my arced sword, my blade. We started exchanging blows. His axe and sword were getting caught by the toothed edges of my blade and could easily throw his attacks off my direction. As I noticed this, I timed his attack and caught his axe in its base and sent it flying. I then swung my blade back and forth. My force added to the weight and the length of my sword was starting to get to him. Every swing I make, the curve of my blade was acting like a hook that was getting through his defense. Yet, I wasn't landing a clean hit, and it aggravated me even further. I raised my arm to make a wide swing coming from the back, but it created an opening for him, and he stabbed me, which punctured my abdomen. The pain from this attack elevated my adrenaline threefold. I grabbed his sword with my remaining hand and held it tightly in place. I yelled and swung my blade with all my strength placed in one heavy blow, and I cut the man down in a single slash. My blade went through his collarbone, right down into his heart. His blade was spilling out as I kept on growling, like a primitive beast celebrating his brutal kill. As I removed my blade from his body, the dead man fell flat on his chest. I looked down on him, and my heart was completely shattered by what I discovered. I fell on my knees and cried. The guy I just brutally killed had a tattoo of a marijuana leaf and the dark web symbol on his back. The masked madman was Gary. I deeply, deeply regret what I'd done to my dear friend, and I wanted to kill myself right then and there. What have they done to him? Aside from his mask, his complexion had changed that I didn't even recognize him. What kind of suffering did he experience that he totally lost his sanity? And what have I turned into? I was just celebrating my kill a moment ago. What were in those IVs? What did they put me inside of? The moment I felt pain, an unnatural adrenaline started to overwhelm me as my rage completely took over my body and my mind. They turned me into a merciless monster. They made me kill my friend and made me feel good about it like it was an accomplishment. I bawled my eyes out as my cry echoed in the room. I was filled with regret and sorrow. It shouldn't have been this way. This was my fault for craving something more in life. My desperation has led me to this hell. And Gary fell victim. A few minutes later, I was shot by a dart that instantly dozed me off. They sedated me like an animal in the wild, They grabbed my legs and dragged me back to my cage as I kept on staring at Gary's dead body laying on the ground. I did that. I did that to him. I did that to my only friend. I kept on mourning him silently as they pulled the cage back to the corridor. The metal doors shut, and so were my eyes. I blacked out once again. This time, I wished to never wake up again. I became one of their toys that the sick bastards enjoyed watching. I gave in to the rage, and I was no longer myself. If ever I wake up, I would be nothing more but a heartless beast. A character in this freak show who hates the game. I was pretty good at it. They wouldn't dispose of me that easily.